Welcome back, guys, to the third video of part 1 of CSS for Bitstream Academy. I'm Shelby, and I will be going over these next few slides with you and showing you how to add some more styles to your code. So before we move on, let's do a quick review and recap of what we went over in the last video. We started to add some more fun elements to your site in terms of fonts. So I went over things like your font family and your font size, as well as even adding Google Fonts to your site. So let's again reference my index file. And in my HTML, remember I added from that last video this link to a style sheet that the Google Fonts website provided that has those Google Fonts I included from their website. And remember, it's very important that you put any reference in your HTML before your link to your style sheet that is referencing anything from those files. Otherwise, your CSS is not going to know what these font families are. From there, in my styles, I've applied these font family declarations that the Google Font website gave to me to not only the body tag, but to the headings on my website as well. The body tag font family is going to apply to all text selectors within your site. But because I went in and specifically targeted all of these headings with that other font family, that is going to render on my website and show that the paragraph tags are different from these headings, even though I didn't necessarily give those paragraph tags that font family style in my CSS. If I wanted to, I could go in and add a paragraph tag and put that font family in there to change that for my paragraphs. But for now, we will leave it to be the body tag so it targets all of the text in there. So this is what my site looks like. I have a nice bold font for all of my headings and a very easy to read font for the rest of my text on my website. And that's pretty much where we left off with the last video when we added some fonts to your website. So let's keep moving forward because now we have a bunch of rules in here and we want to learn a few things that we can start organizing these and also adding a few more fun elements to your site. A great example of what we're going to be going over today, I can get to the Bitstream Academy site, is to notice on here how we have this big heading with this white font, but then this heading down here looks completely different. And then we start to have sections that have the gray background and the blue background. And there's really no way to achieve this look with how we are applying our CSS right now to all selectors. So say, for example, these are both H2s in my code. How do I necessarily get this one to be white, but this one to stay that gray color? We'll be covering that today in this video. But first, a few concepts that I think we should go over before we keep writing more CSS in our style sheet file. So there is a concept called dry, and this stands for don't repeat yourself. And this is a very general coding principle that I think is very important. And it is very common that once you start writing more CSS rules and adding declarations to your file, that your code becomes pretty repetitive. And to fix that, we use something what's called IDs and classes. So IDs versus classes, what are they? An ID is something that should only apply to one element on a web page. Example, a web page only has one footer. So in that case, the ID of footer would be a great attribute to add to your footer in your HTML. Whereas a class can be applied to lots of elements on your site, and many of them can have the same class. So for example, there could be many headings on your web page that you want to style the same way that is not similar to others. And with the dot is how you tell your CSS that that is a class name. Rather, this pound sign is how you tell your CSS that you are targeting an ID on your site. Now, it's important to know that these two concepts are going to be attributes that you are adding to the HTML of your site. That will be selectors that you will use in your CSS. So right now, our selectors don't have any characters in front of them, but moving forward, it's very important to remember that when you are selecting something with an ID rather than that HTML element, you need to be using the pound sign. And when you're targeting something that has a class, you need to use that dot. So an ID, here's a good example of what a CSS rule would look like when you are targeting an ID. So this example here shows that this declaration is going to be applied to anything on your page that has this ID of footer. And remember, only one ID per page, so this is a very good visual to show that this will be a style applied to only one element on your page, and in this case, it's your element with the ID of footer. So to pair that with the HTML, this is what your HTML would look like that has that ID of footer applied to it. So the divs, or those divisions that you went over with Chris in the HTML section, will now have more information added to it through these attributes of ID and class. Here is that attribute being added of ID, and remember, with attributes you need to have that equal sign, and the value for that attribute will be in between quotes. So this is saying that this div has the ID of footer. Anything inside of it's going to be affected by the style set in this CSS rule. So again, the big difference between this CSS rule and our current CSS rules is that there is a new character that will be added to the selector to tell the browser that those styles are being applied to something with an ID, or in another instance, a class. So here is a class selector. These are attributes that can be applied to many elements on your site, and they can still have the same value. Here's a CSS rule of warning, and it is saying that anything with the class of warning in your HTML will now have the color red. And here's an example of what some HTML could look like with that class. So this is saying this paragraph tag will have the class warning, and the text in here is going to be red because you applied this CSS rule to that. Remember, by adding this attribute to this p tag, it is only going to affect this paragraph, and all the other paragraphs on your website are going to remain the same. So classes and IDs are just a really powerful way to start really selecting specific elements on your site and adding more styles to them and not having to add them globally. This is going to be a short lesson because this concept is when you can really start adding a ton of unique styles to your site to get that header style, to get different paragraphs to be different colors, maybe a different background color on a different section of your website. So let's take a minute, and you guys can watch me go through this really quick to add 2 examples of how we're going to add an ID and a class to a div that we've created. So in my example, I'm going to show you how we can achieve this look of the Bitstream Academy site and add a different color to a header section. In one of your past videos, Chris showed you how to add divs to your site. And they right now don't have much meaning to you, but they're going to be very important now because we're going to be adding some classes and IDs to them. So let's say I want my heading and that image of Baby Yoda to be in its own section. I'm actually going to keep it where it is in this main content div and wrap them in a new div. So I save that, and you can see still nothing has changed on my site because that is just a plain div tag with no information to it. I'm going to go back in and add a class of header. And because I did this, nothing still is going to change on my site, but this gives my CSS a lot more power to target everything inside this div only. So I'm going to go into my styles with the class. We have to put the dot and whatever that matching value was to that attribute of class. And let's do background color. A color from that color scheme picker of a little bit darker tan because I really want that header section to stand out compared to the rest of my site. Now, when I refresh my site, you can see that div that I put around those 2 items with that attribute of a class of header has more styles applied to it that only are affecting this area. Everything around here in the background color of all of these are pretty much staying the same. Another good example is, say I want this heading to be that white color, but I want this one to say this same color. I'm going to go into my index file and find that heading that I want to change. And we'll give this one another easy class of styled header. It's important to know that you can really add whatever value you want inside of this attribute, but you need to be sure that whatever you name it matches the selector that you are putting in your styles. So I named that one styled header. Paste it. I copy and paste them just to make sure I always am typing them incorrectly. Otherwise, the CSS, say I put this in as style header, this isn't matching that value of that attribute that I put on that heading, but it's still not going to error out because the code technically wouldn't be wrong for this selector. So it's very important to remember that these selectors need to be the same value that you're putting into that class or ID attribute. For an example, we're going to do color white for anything with the class of styled header. White is a color that is in that list of 17 colors that works for your websites, but for testing purposes, I'm just going to use that for now. You can see when I refresh my page, now that header that has that class of styled header is the only one that CSS declaration is applied to. So once you start adding these IDs and classes to your CSS and your HTML, you can kind of see how you can start really customizing what things look like on your page. So let's take a few minutes and have you add some IDs and classes to the divs that you've already created in your HTML, and then start adding CSS rules to target these elements. Chris and I will be standing by to help you guys if you need anything, so be sure to reach out to us on Discord. Good luck!